Okay. Well, as I mentioned, thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Jeff Hoey, and I am the Executive Director of New Jersey Peace Action. We are a 63-year-old grassroots peace organization dedicated to the goal of a more peaceful, more sustainable planet in my lifetime. Tonight, we'll be discussing the interlocking crises of militarism and climate change. These two topics are so inextricably linked that they need to be talked about as one issue. One that won't be mitigated until we solve the underlying causes. Before we begin, I want to let you know that all attendees will be muted during the webinar. If you wish to ask questions of the panelists, please make sure you use the Q&A button below. Please keep your questions short and concise and about the content we're talking about tonight. If your question is for a particular panelist, please make that clear as well. This webinar is being live streamed on New Jersey Peace Action's Facebook page and will be posted to our YouTube channel in a day or so. If you go to our YouTube channel to view the recording, please help us out and subscribe to our channel. Tonight, we're joined by two wonderful panelists, and I want to thank them both for being here tonight. Many of you will recognize Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington and of the Amsterdam-based Transnational Institute. She writes and speaks widely across the US and internationally on Middle East issues, including Palestine-Israel, US wars, and US foreign policy, appearing in the media, lecturing at universities and teach-ins, briefing parliamentarians and government officials. She is a co-founder of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and currently serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace and on the board of the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg. Her books include Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer, and Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Palestine issues and was shortlisted twice to become a UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in the occupied territory. We're also joined by Ted Glick, and we'll hear from him first. Ted has devoted 51 years of his life to a progressive social change movement. Over the years, Ted's commitment to social justice has led him to partake in 20 extended fasts, 6 of which were for more than a month, including the climate emergency fast in the fall of 2007 and 2 fasts in 2009. During the climate emergency fast, he ate no solid food for 107 days as part of an effort to get Congress to pass strong climate legislation. Ted is the author of the just published book, Burglar for Peace, Lessons Learned in the Catholic Left's Resistance to the Vietnam War. I want to welcome Ted personally as well. Ted is a longtime, and his wife Jane, longtime supporters of New Jersey Peace Action. Thank you both for being here. Ted, why don't we go over to you first for your thoughts on this great subject, and we'll be back to you in a little while. Thanks everybody for being here.
All right, well, thank you, Jeff, and it's really an honor to be speaking with Phyllis on this call. I do have a long history in the peace movement, going back to the Vietnam War, but for the last 17 years, my primary focus of work has been on the climate crisis because of the Western European heat wave in the summer of 2003, when 40,000 or more people died. I took the time to look into this issue of global warming, the climate crisis, and realized things were much further along and much more imminent than I had thought they were. And one of the first things that I started to work on as I realized I needed to do more on this issue, I hooked up with Father Paul Mayer and with Connie Hogarth, both of whom were very active. Connie Hogarth still is in the peace and justice movement. And also Damu Smith. I want to remember Damu Smith. He came to a founding meeting that Paul and Connie and I organized of a group called the Climate Crisis Coalition that no longer exists, but for a number of years we were very active on this issue of the climate crisis. And in fact, our primary work at first was reaching out to the peace movement. We felt that we were natural allies. The issue of the climate, the issue of war and peace, the threat of devastation from nuclear weapons, or the threat of devastation and the unraveling of societies from climate change and the everything that would come with that if it continued. We felt there'd be, we were natural allies, and I still believe that. And certainly there are many people in the peace and justice movement who have over time become more active in this fight around the climate. One effort I was part of was a group called No War, No Warming. It's around the time of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War in the mid-2000s. We had demonstrations, civil disobedience up on Capitol Hill. I think there were at least 60 or 70 of us who were arrested for various blockades that we held. And we very consciously, again, were linking the issue of wars for oil, with the global warming process that was happening as fossil fuels were being burned. Code Pink was one of the groups that was very active with No War, No Warming, and back in that time, I want to call them out. And there were a lot of young people. A lot of young people were active in that No War, No Warming action and that movement. One of the things that is significant about the climate movement is the involvement of young people, and also very much that there is a whole climate justice movement of primarily people of color, focused on not just the issue of climate change, but the issue of all of the polluting impacts of the fossil fuel industry in communities where people live, the power plants that spew out the toxic poisons, the automobile and automobiles and trucks and buses, diesel fuels, regular fuels, gasoline powered, as opposed to electric cars, which are a coming thing. That there are the asthma attacks, the respiratory impacts on people living in inner cities, predominantly people of color. Those are all very real issues that are integrated into the climate movement and are very much about justice issues for sure. Of course, one of the, as I mentioned, there is the whole issue of wars for oil. I mean, a lot, the whole, what happened in the Middle East, what happened in Afghanistan, very much was related to the United States' efforts to, and practical successes in dominating countries in that region where there was oil and gas. So there was a real connection. There has been a real connection between militarism and a fossil fuel, an economy that is powered by fossil fuels. So that I remember a long time ago when I was actually campaigning in the early 2000s, that we were calling for renewable energy, the need to shift away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, so that we could get away from the militarism and the warlike economy, stop these wars for oil, for control of countries where those resources were, and to build a different kind of economy, a peacetime economy with clean energy sources, particularly the sun and the wind, as far as energy, as well as energy from water sources, the tides, the currents, and so on. But there's another aspect, though, in terms of a connection, and that is that as the climate crisis continues to deepen, we see a ever increasing a number of people and a spread of massive refugee movements. We see it here in the United States. The caravans of thousands of people coming up from Central America, a couple years ago, that of course Trump exploited as best as he could. And we know what happened when people got across the border, and what happened to the separations that happened. So that human misery, as people are forced to leave their homes because of droughts, because of major storms that just keep coming, because of fires and floods and so on. So there's a real connection there between the climate and the increasing tensions that can lead to war. And there is no question, but there have been some more localized conflicts, very much rooted in the devastation that's come with droughts, very much made much worse because of the process of climate change. The whole situation in Syria, for example, many people, I'd be interested in Phyllis's knowledge on this, but many people think that one of the causes of the Syrian civil war was the drought in that part of the world that went on for many, many years, and that really disrupted human societies, caused a lot of misery, and led to some of the tensions and the issues that existed in that country becoming worse, leading to war. So there's clearly connection there. And kind of the last main thing I want to just touch on for a little bit, and then the comment on, is that the climate crisis is and has been serious for such a long time that for at least the last 10 years, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, has been putting out studies, I think they're pretty much annual studies now, identifying climate change as what they call a, quote, significant threat to national security. There was something that I researched today from 2010, when the first of these, as from what I can tell, when the first of these came out, and they did this whole analysis, identified climate change as a force multiplier, I believe is the way they put it, that it is something that will lead to more conflict, lead to more war, etc. Competition for scarce resources made even more scarce because of changes, negative changes in the conditions of people, the way people live. And in this little summary of this document that they put out in 2010, the very last point in this summary is this one. You know, they're mainly talking about, because strategically, what do we do? You know, how do we shift resources here and there to kind of try to contain conflicts, et cetera? That kind of role as the policeman of the world. There's all of that kind of stuff. And then, but then there's one of the last point says, the department is increasing its use of renewable energy supplies and reducing energy demand to improve operational effectiveness, reduce greenhouse gas emissions in support of U.S. climate change initiatives, and protect the department from energy price fluctuations. So I remember as a climate activist and as a peace activist, you know, feeling kind of conflicted when I started reading the stories about these Pentagon studies and what they were coming out and saying, because from a climate standpoint, it was a good thing that the Department of Defense was saying that renewable energy is a good thing and that there's a need to be a shifting to that. That's a good thing. But of course, if there's no change in the mission of the Pentagon, if it's still about U.S. dominance of the world and maintaining the 700 military bases around the world and all the rest of it, well, you know, that's a problem. That's a problem. But I have to say, the climate movement is a very varied thing, as is true of most movements. And take any particular movement, it's generally has variation and differences. And without question, there are groups in the climate movement who really downplay connections to militarism, connections to war. And I think this study is a kind of a case in point that they want the Pentagon to be using renewable energy and not oil and gas or coal. They want to have them get off fossil fuels because they want everybody to get off the fossil fuels, as do I. But so they soften, if they soften their critique of the Pentagon and the role that it often plays in the world. But there definitely are within the climate movement, the climate justice movement, I say particularly more within the climate justice movement, where people of color are, I think, much more attuned to this issue. There's a lot of people who get it on the connection between militarism and climate change, and it's kind of like a back and forth thing. And, each movement is going to have its own particular day-to-day work, its day-to-day focuses. But there's no question, but there are very real connections. And I'm glad I can help somewhat in moving that process forward, that we work more closely together. Thank you.
Jeff, you're still muted.
And I thank you very much for being here. So thank you very much, Ted. Phyllis, you've been doing a lot of work on this subject. Recently, especially, I know, but I know things that IPS has been working on go back a little ways as well. If you could speak to the whole process of what you folks are doing, especially about that new study that came out that I'll send the link out to everybody for, and how you see this as so linked that you really can't separate the two. I think that's a part of how you look at it. I'd love to hear more about that, but please take it wherever you want to go.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff. And thanks, Ted. Thanks a lot for reminding us about the work that you've done and the work of Connie Hogarth and Damu and Paul, great friends of so many movements for so many decades now. You know, when we talk about the intersectional connections between the climate movement, climate justice, and anti-militarism, you're right, you really can't separate those. And there's other movements as well. There's other issues that we can't separate either. It's one of the reasons that I think we at IPS have been so lucky in building our relationship over the last 3 years or so with the Poor People's Campaign, which is grounded, for those of you not as familiar with the work of the Poor People's Campaign, it's grounded in the notion of 4 interconnected evils. The 3 evils identified by Dr. Martin Luther King back in 1967 in his speech coming out against the war in Vietnam, where he talked about the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, and then added climate to that, so that the 4 are inextricably connected. And if we look at our country right now, the world as a whole, but most especially right here, the crises that we're facing, the crisis of racism and state violence with the horrific killings just in the last 24 hours or so, killings of 1 Black man and the paralyzing, perhaps for life, of another, both shot in the back by police, one in New Orleans and one in Kenosha, Wisconsin. That pandemic of racism, the pandemic of the COVID virus, and the economic crisis that it has called, the rising levels of poverty, the poverty crisis, the climate crisis that is showing no signs of getting anything but worse, and the crisis of war, which continues around the world. And they are all connected. You know, the war and militarism cause the climate crisis, and the climate crisis causes wars. Both create the others. They are completely connected. The pamphlet that some of my colleagues at IPS just finished, it's just been published in a month or so, I guess, is called No Warming, No War. And it's aimed particularly at activists in the climate movement, talking about the links with militarism and with war and what the connections are. One of the key points that's always so shocking, I think, to people who are not as familiar with this, and Ted alluded to it, the Pentagon itself is the biggest institutional producer of greenhouse gases in the world, bar none. It produces more, it uses more fossil fuels every day than Sweden, the whole country of Sweden. You know, so if we're talking about cutting back on fossil fuels, the Pentagon is where we have to start, not from the vantage point of greening the Pentagon, as Ted was talking about. You know, this is not the answer. The answer is stop doing things to kill people all around the world that require fossil fuels. You know, at the height of the Afghan war, I guess it was about 2008, the Pentagon was spending $20 billion a year on air conditioning for US troops. It was one of those, what? Did you just say that? Yeah, we just said that. It was one of those shocking moments. The Syria war, which again, Ted alluded to, one of the major causes, without a doubt, of that crisis was a 3-year drought across Syria. Syria was for millennia known as the breadbasket of the Levant, the breadbasket of that part of the Middle East. And over a 3-year period from 2006 to 2009, over 800,000 farmers and their families were driven off the land because they could not grow wheat, they could not grow anything because the rains had essentially stopped. And what happens when people are driven off the land? They head to the cities to find work. Now, there was a time in the past when Syria had a kind of state socialist sort of economy where there were just always enough state-based jobs available to take up that slack. But that ended in about 2000 when a kind of neoliberalism took over in Syria and privatization was the name of the game. There were no jobs available, very few jobs available. So the vast majority of those 800,000 farmers and their families were unable to find work. The few that were generally were chosen on the basis of sectarian frameworks that had never been an issue in Syria. There were plenty of problems, there were plenty of political problems, problems of repression, other things, but sectarianism wasn't a big problem historically in Syria. Suddenly it was, because what happened when a few jobs became available, who did they go to? They went to people who knew someone in power or close to power. And that meant they were more likely, not necessarily, but they were more likely to be Alawites, the minority religious sect that was closer to the top governing officials, particularly the family of the president. So that made the problem of sectarianism in Syria worse, made the war when it broke out even worse. And Syria, of course, has now been one of the biggest sources in the recent decades of the huge refugee crisis that is underway around the world, where there are now 70 million people displaced around the world, more than at any time since World War II. 26 million of them are refugees. And among them, Syrians are, I think, about 9. It's a huge proportion of that. And that's all related to this intersection of climate crisis and the crisis of war that together have created this huge issue of displacement and refugees. If we take a step back, and look at the question of the history of this country, we see that militarism was central to the very origins of the United States, the origins of this country. We know from the great historian Howard Zinn, the origins of this country being rooted in genocide against Native people and the enslavement of Black Africans brought to this country in chains. Part of the genocide meant killing the indigenous environment that indigenous populations relied on to survive. And that meant for the white settlers who came from Europe, it meant they had to, right from the beginning, they had to demonize the other. The other at that time were Native people, the indigenous people, the Indians, who were demonized to justify to their own people the need to carry out mass slaughter. And that included destruction of the environment. In the plains, it meant destruction of the buffalo herds that Plains Indians relied on to make the plains unlivable. There's a famous Colonel, John Chivington, who was a general during the Civil War, and following the war, he became a noted, what they used to call an Indian killer. And he led his soldiers to a place called Sand Creek during the Indian Wars in the 1880s. And he famously said when it was raised to him that many of the Indian tribes that he was attacking were peaceful tribes that were just trying to live their lives the way they had lived for hundreds and thousands of years. And his quote was, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. Kill and scalp them all. Big and little, nits make lice." This was the root of Manifest Destiny, and it all relied on militarism. These were the earliest wars of the United States. And the land was a victim of those wars. The land was not only where these wars were fought, it was for the land that they were fought, for control of the land. Military technology was used to conquer the land and take it away from those who had lived as part of nature to turn it over to those who would instead conquer nature. And we see that today in the same intersection where you have the struggles over pipelines, the struggle in 5 years ago in Standing Rock, the latest version of these kinds of colonial destructive efforts to take over the environment using the military. And you had the military, you had soldiers as well as armed police playing the role that the, quote, Indian killers had played 150 years, 200 years before. You also had anti-war United States veterans, Veterans for Peace, about-face Veterans Against War, who came to stand with the Native communities at Standing Rock, and among other things, to participate in ceremonies of apology for their origins, the origins of the military in the Indian Wars. And the other thing that I think is so important for us as activists is remembering what Howard Zinn also said. He taught us about those origins and how they come together, but he also reminded us that the origins of this country was not only in genocide and slavery, but also in the movements against genocide and slavery that erupted right from the beginning. Sometimes won, sometimes lost in their various specific struggles, but always existed as movements that were very connected to each other. We're seeing that now with the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote, and the origins of that suffrage movement in the movement against slavery, and how those two things were connected, not always very well. The women's suffrage movement was a thoroughly racist movement, with the exception of some individuals. It took a very long time for women of color to be fought for and fought with for the right to vote. But from the beginning, it was people who had been active in the abolitionist movement against slavery who then took up the struggle for women's rights. So that question of connection and intersectionality is very much a part of it. Now, when we look at the consequences of these wars that the US has waged, you know, it moved west to conquer the land, moved west in what was known as manifest destiny, gets to the West Coast, and then you just keep on going. Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, etc. And you have an empire. And of course, the costs of these wars, which we see here at home, are much higher, obviously, in the targeted countries where the wars are actually fought than they are here. You know, Ted mentioned this question of the role of oil in the origins of the war in Afghanistan. It was a little less direct there. It was questions of pipelines and stuff, certainly, but that was not the main war of that period anyway. That was a kind of sideline war just to sort of prepare the public for the real war, which was going to be the war in Iraq, where oil was very central. It wasn't the only reason. This was not just a war for oil. It was a war for oil. It was a war for power. It was a war for military bases. It was a war for the extension of the ability of the military to extend its power to 3 different continents. It was many different things, but oil was certainly one of them. But if we look at the costs of these wars, one of the biggest costs is to the environment itself. You know, we know there are human costs. There are the costs of displacement, the cost to refugees, social fabric being shredded, the cost to human rights, the cost in money that can no longer be used for desperately needed social welfare of various sorts. And you do have this massive attack on the economy in so many places. Environmental destruction takes place both where the wars are fought and here at home, where we see things like what Ted was talking about in terms of in the climate justice movement. One of the big issues is identifying in which communities do they build the most polluting industries. And many of those industries have a lot to do with producing weapons. If we look at what happened in New Mexico, for instance, where uranium was available, what happened to the people who live downwind? They're even known as downwinders. They were almost all indigenous people. Some were Mexicans, but most were indigenous. Very few were white settlers in that area. And it was aimed that way. That was not an accident. It's very similar to what you see in the West Bank, for instance, where Israeli settlements that are built on the top of hills, as most of them are, all have an industrial zone, and they're sited in a way that makes sure that the industrial waste flies off down the hill, down the mountain, down the sides of the slopes to the Palestinian villages below. So they face the same kind of environmental injustice as we see in the movement here. At the international level, we see in the history of these movements with how environmental destruction takes place alongside the killing of civilians, war crimes, the undermining of sovereignty and the destruction of diplomacy, the violations of international law, all of that. We saw in Korea the consequences, in Japan, the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons and what that did to a vast territory far beyond the cities that were the first targets when the US, the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons. In Vietnam, we saw the use of Agent Orange designed to wipe out the green material on any land, to just simply wipe out all plant life. In Iraq, it was depleted uranium that played that same role, that destroyed so much of the environment. And of course, in both Vietnam and Iraq, you have the human impact, not only on US soldiers, although they're affected as well, but on people who live in those areas, particularly children who are especially vulnerable, who can't get away from them. In the current post 9/11 wars, the young soldiers speak of burn pits. It's a term I had never even heard in my years working against the war in Iraq. In the war in Vietnam or in Iraq until more recently. But the global war on terror, the most notable example of environmental crime are these so-called burn pits, where all kinds of chemicals, plastics, anything you can name is simply tossed into giant pits of burning to destroy this stuff so it's not caught by the other side when troops are moved or pull out or whatever. And the effect is devastating to the health of people, the soldiers who have to staff these pits, but also the people in the neighborhoods where they are built. So this kind of environmental catastrophe, of course, creates even greater refugee catastrophes. Then we have the question of the cost at home. We talk all the time these days, which is fantastic, about the need for a Green New Deal and what a Green New Deal would look like. A Green New Deal is many things. And one of the things that's so great about the discourse shift towards the mainstreaming, if you will, of what a Green New Deal would look like, is that it includes more than just ending fossil fuels. It includes job creation, it includes education, it includes healthcare, it includes all kinds of things. And it has to include anti-militarism for a whole bunch of reasons. I wrote a couple of articles on this. One of them is in Jacobin, and I think Jeff was going to make that link available. But if we look at why do we say that the Green New Deal needs anti-militarism and an anti-war component, we can start with the military budget. You know, the question about the Green New Deal is almost never, that's a bad idea, we shouldn't do it. It's always, it's too expensive. How are you going to pay for it? You know, that's the question that is assumed to have no answer. Well, the starting point of the answer is we cut the military budget. Our proposal at IPS, and it's the proposal of the Poor People's Campaign as well, is that we start by cutting the military budget almost in half, that we cut $350 billion out of the military budget. And we have brilliant people at IPS who run the National Priorities Project, and they know how to do it in a way that will keep us safer and not make us less safe, which is the usual answer to that. But at a time when 53 cents out of every discretionary federal dollar is diverted directly to the military, why are we surprised that paying for the Green New Deal or paying for Medicare for all or paying for free college education or paying for infrastructure or anything seems so impossible? We can change that. We can change that, and we have to change that. So there's two reasons we have to cut the military budget. And as peace activists, we have to be sure to always include them both. The first one is the reason that everybody should be taking up the need to cut the military budget. That's where we're going to find the money. So for everybody who's fighting for a Green New Deal, everyone who's fighting for a $15 minimum wage, everybody who's fighting for more support for people who have lost their jobs because of the pandemic, everybody who's fighting for everything that costs something, they should be fighting to cut the military budget. They should also be, and we should be sure, that we always say that the other reason, just as important or more so, to cut the military budget is so that we stop killing people around the world. We can't afford to leave either of those reasons out of the equation. So just a few numbers here. If we cut $350 billion, if we cut almost half the military budget, that would provide a full payment for Medicare for all for a year, and with $50 billion left over, that could be a starting point for a Green New Deal. Not a bad deal. If we took just 1% of the 2019 military budget, which was $716 billion, one of those unfathomable numbers. What does it even mean? But trust me, it's a lot. If we took 1% of that, we would be able to create 128,879 green infrastructure jobs. 1%, just 1%. It's extraordinary. If we cut $650 billion from the military budget, which is about 6/7 of it, which is something that Forbes, of all places, in one place said that we should do. It's kind of interesting. I'm guessing it was a mistake, but nonetheless, they said it. We could pay for a combination of 100% of a shift to renewable energy sources, which is estimated to be about $200 billion, build a smart power grid based on renewable technology, $40 billion for that, draw down all the use of greenhouse gases, that would be about $110 billion, and upgrade homes and buildings across the country, $250 billion. We could do all that for just that one cut from of a large percentage of the military budget. So we have to look at all these ways that the military and the wars affect us here at home as well. The militarization of our communities. Why is it that when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014, for the first time we were seeing armored personnel carriers on the streets going after protesters? Now we see it all the time in the protests against police brutality after the killing of George Floyd at the end of May. In the protests that ranged across the country, in every major city, we saw an armored personnel carrier, or several of them, as part of the arsenal of the local police. That's a weapon of war. That's not a policing tool. Why do they have them? Well, they have them because the Pentagon, in its eminent wisdom, makes them available for free every time there's a troop withdrawal out of Afghanistan or out of Iraq or out of wherever. They don't want to leave things like armored personnel carriers in that country, so they pay a fortune to ship them home and make them available through a Pentagon project called the 1033 program that allows any local or state law enforcement agency to just call the Pentagon and say, hi, we'd like a couple of those armored personnel carriers you have available. Can we have one? Sure, no problem. When do you want to pick it up? No muss, no fuss. And as long as we have wars that are based on profit for the war profiteers in this country, they're going to continue making way more armored personnel carriers than anybody needs in Afghanistan. They're going to continue to bring them home, and they're going to continue to send them around the country to be used against protesters. That's why this is part of the anti-racist movement, and it's part of the climate movement, and it's part of the movement against poverty. So let me just say, when Dr. King said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. We have to say that it's also approaching the physical death of this planet. And let me just say one other thing, actually two other things that are just resources for folks to use. One is the moral budget of the Poor People's Campaign. The original piece from 2 years ago that's called The Souls of Poor Folk is we worked on it with them. It's a joint project of IPS and the Poor People's Campaign. It's 50 years after Martin Luther King's original call for a Poor People's Campaign. And it looks at what happens over that 50 years, specifically in this intersection between racism, poverty, militarism, and climate. So it's a very useful sort of analytical framework for all this. The other resource is, and I think many of you are familiar with the work of the National Priorities Project, which I'm very proud is now a project of IPS, and we get to call them all the time for questions. It's the best cheat sheet for any peace activist anywhere. You go to their website, you go to the Tradeoffs thing, and you put in your city, your state, your county, or your congressional district, or the whole country, and you can choose the military budget this year, the war in Afghanistan since 2001, the war in Iraq this year, the war in Iraq since 2003. You can pick any of those. And then you have it'll tell you how much tax money is going from that city to pay for that part of the military budget. And then the good part, because these numbers, they don't mean anything. You know, you can say, well, the budget is 737 billion this year. You know, you might as well say it's a gazillion for all that anybody really understands what's $1 billion. So the way to do it is to compare it, have the trade-off. If you didn't spend that amount of money on the wars, what else could you spend it on? So you hit the trade-off button and immediately you get your choice of about, I guess it's about 12 or 15 options. And you can choose one of them, you can choose all of them, you can have a combination any way you like. It's great fun to play with it. Go to your own town and you'll see it. It's kind of shocking. And boy, when you go out to speak, when you speak at a high school, when you speak at the Rotary Club, you look like the smartest person that ever walked into that town because nobody else knows this stuff, I promise you. And it will tell you how many kids could get a slot in Head Start for that amount of money. How many teachers could you hire? How many soldiers could get healthcare when they come back from a war? How many students could get a Pell Grant to go to college? There's all kinds of them. How many houses could be retrofitted with green technology? It's an amazing tool that makes our work a whole lot easier. And I think what it means is we have a huge amount of work to do, but we have allies that don't even necessarily all know that they're allies, just as we are allies of the anti-racist movement and the women's movement and the LGBT rights movement and the climate justice movement. Those movements are all allies of the peace movement. We're all in it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. That was wonderful. And you're right, we're all in this together, and there's so many different movements that are so key to this, key to us being successful. And it's becomes clearer and clearer every day that one movement is not going to succeed without the success of other movements together, and working together is the way to go. We do have a number of questions that I want to get to as soon as possible because time goes by so quickly. I had one come in by email from Lucy, and you touched on this, but it does go in a little more detail. Have either one of you spoken to AOC or any other sponsors of Green New Deal legislation about including reduction of the military to pay for the initiatives? Has that conversation happened?
It's happening. There have been conversations. I haven't talked with AOC about it directly. I've talked with a number of congressional staff, and I've talked a lot with some of the activists who are working on it, the folks in Sunrise, the folks, others who have been involved in the drafting of the Green New Deal language, et cetera. And it's difficult. It's difficult. They have worked with a lot of other movements, and they've included a lot of other language in it. There's stuff about immigration rights. There's a number of things. We have not yet gotten to the right set of people in the right circumstances where the specific one-liner in that list in the Green New Deal of all the things. I even wrote the draft for them of what that one sentence should be. It'll get in there. It'll get in there. It isn't, I don't think it is yet. But you know, the Green New Deal as it exists is an educational project. It's not yet something that's going to emerge from Congress as we're going to vote on it next week and it's going to happen. You know, it's still something that's changing the discourse of how we talk about all these interrelated things. So it's moving towards that. It's moving towards that.
Great. Opinions on this. How can we best approach, this is from Litsa Bender. How can we best approach a new Biden administration on the need to reduce the military budget and focus on the climate crisis? Ted, you want to?
Yeah, I will say that though the Biden campaign's positions when it comes to climate during the campaign were not very good, they were not very strong, that there has been movement in the right direction as a result of the Bernie Sanders campaign and the Biden campaign forming these task forces in different areas. And I know in the climate area in particular, there was some movement that's positive in terms of stronger positions on the part of the Biden campaign. Certainly not what's required in terms of actually solving this crisis and getting out of it. It's not there. We're not there yet, but it's moving in the right direction. So I think that's helpful in terms of the question when it comes to, however, the Biden administration being willing to really take on the Pentagon, take on militarism, take on the U.S. role in the world. That might be a harder nut to crack, frankly. I'd be interested in what Phyllis thinks about that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The Biden administration's position on foreign policy in general, war spending, the global war on terror, et cetera, China, all these issues, I think are where they are the farthest from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I agree with Ted that there's been some very significant movement on climate. There also has been on immigration and on a couple of other issues, which is fabulous. When the teams were established for the 6 areas that linked people from Bernie's campaign and the Biden campaign together, and they came up with these, sort of compromise positions representing both the centrist, so-called moderate wing of the party and the progressive wing. They did very well in most cases. They didn't have one for foreign policy. It's going to be a hard slog, I think, for those who take up that work, because Joe Biden believes that foreign policy is his strong suit. He has traveled the world. He knows people in government around the world. And I'm guessing that means he doesn't think he needs to get a lot of outside opinions and such on foreign policy. It's going to be a very hard slog. I do think that what has changed is that there are people in Congress who are taking positions that were once absolutely unimaginable, even though they are still small and they're not winning yet. So for example, there was a vote in the House on cutting the military budget by 10%. Now, on the level of, cutting a giant budget, 10% is chump change. But that's $74 billion that they were talking about cutting. There has never been a vote in Congress to cut a military budget. So that was historic. That was historic. And in the coming Congress, we will certainly see several more people who will be part of an expanded version of the squad. The squad's going to have its first male member, maybe 2, and several other women as well. So, the generational shift is part of all this. And this is a long-term struggle. This is not going to happen overnight. But I think that there is going to be more pressure coming to Congress and more pressure coming from Congress towards the administration than we've seen in quite a long time. So I'm not optimistic exactly, but I think that it's going to be a struggle that moves forward very quickly right from the beginning. The other thing is that there are people right now that are talking about what's going to happen if there is a Biden victory, and particularly if there's also Democratic control of both the House and the Senate. There are options that were not available before but will require massive mobilization starting on day 1. So starting on the day after inauguration. That's the day people will be in the streets, people will be in the suites. And yeah, it's going to take a lot of work.
Thank you both. There's a number of questions here, and I'll just answer it. The name of the organization that Phyllis referred to was the National Priorities Project, and I'll get that link out to you to that Tradeoffs site. There'll be a follow-up email tomorrow. If you don't mind, I'm going to wait till that. I may try to get it in the chat window here, but I'm asking questions as well. So it may just be in the follow-up email that I'll send out tomorrow. Next question. How do you recommend we integrate specific peace and conflict resolution tactics like restorative justice and conflict mediation in the anti-militarism, anti-racist, climate justice, etc. movements? Anybody want to grab it?
One of the things that I talk about a lot and write about a lot is the necessity of we very consciously need to be about building a different way of doing things as we work together within our movements, that we need a culture that is all about nonviolent forms of interaction with one another, forms of resolving differences and tensions in a way that is as humane and affirming as possible, and not all negative and destructive. I mean, it's a reality that there are going to be differences between people. There's differences between a loving, couple who are married, right? That's real. So we need to be about, to me, it's not just about how do we integrate conflict resolution. It's how do we create a culture within all of our movements, this movement of movements that is developing, and we have to keep building. So that it's much more normal and more natural that when there are conflicts and when there are problems, we are able to resolve them relatively fairly and justly, because that's the kind of people we're becoming.
Well said, Ted. Thank you. Does either one happen to have, and if not, I can do some research to this, how much renewable energy versus fossil fuels does the military use? I mean, how far into the move towards renewable energy are they?
I don't think it's very far. I'm not sure. It's a good question. I don't know the details, but my guess is it's not very far.
The goal was, about 4 years ago, was led by the Navy, that they wanted to get to 50% by, I think it was 2022. Am I right on that, Ted?
I'm not sure. I really don't know, actually.
But it was, I mean, their goal was not 100%. It was 50%. They are serious about this. I would just point out one thing. I think Ted's point is absolutely crucial, that we have to be very careful not to say that the solution to militarism is to green up the Pentagon or something. We also have to keep in mind the impact economically and culturally and politically when the military, because it's such a huge component of the government, and it involves so much of our tax money, and it involves so many millions of people, that what happens in the military does have an impact. So if we look at the question of desegregation, institutional desegregation, the military was one of the first, for all the wrong reasons. We want to rely on people of color to help us go abroad and kill people of color, right? But it did play a role in what happened at home, outside of the military. It had an impact. So we have to have a certain subtlety in how we deal with it. We're not going to stop that process from going forward in the military. We're trying to stop the military, period, full stop. As long as the military exists, it's going to go ahead and try and rely less on fossil fuels because it's less safe from their vantage point. So it is going to have the effect, for example, of making the price of wind turbines and solar panels way cheaper. That's a reality. We have to figure out how to talk about that in a way that's not sort of insulting to the intelligence of people we're talking about, and doesn't come out in support of a green military is what we need, that'll somehow be a good thing. So it's a set of contradictions.
What do either one of you think are the chances? We hear about nuclear weapons and climate change being the two existential threats. The possibility of resource depletion caused by climate change actually being the cause of a small nuclear war, let's say an India-Pakistan conflict. The possibilities of such a thing occurring.
I'd say the possibilities of that happening are increasing basically every day that we don't get serious about making this rapid shift away from fossil fuels to renewables, to energy efficiency, to a just economy, to a Green New Deal, to all those things that are needed so that people's lives are increasingly better. And there truly is justice. I mean, as long as we have the reality that we have in the world of this, the scramble for resources, very much profit driven by private companies and super rich individuals going after those resources. And as long as we are not about this transition, this so essentially needed transition away from this destructive environment destroying, climate disrupting economy that we have to to its opposite, to a clean, truly clean energy and justice-based economy. The odds are getting worse every day. It's just a natural thing to me, given the proliferation of nuclear weapons in different parts of the world. It's a real threat. It is a real threat.
I agree. I would say that the question of internationalism is fundamental to all of our movements. And as we talk about climate justice, as we talk about racial justice, as we talk about opposing wars, opposing Pentagon spending, we have to do it from the vantage point of the world. I think that, ironically, your question, Jeff, implies one thing that I'm not sure is real, which is the notion that if wars are being fought somewhere else among some of the acknowledged or unacknowledged nuclear powers, whether that be Israel, whether it be North Korea, whether it be Pakistan, India, not the 5 official nuclear weapons states, the chances are not that they're going to have a small nuclear weapon. Small ones are harder to make. Miniaturization is the most advanced part. That's what the US is trying to work on, and make it seem possible to use what they like to call tactical nukes. If a nuclear weapon is used somewhere else, it's far more likely to be the old-fashioned kind, which is big and messy and has far more casualties than a so-called targeted one. Casualties both at the level of people and at the level of the earth. So I think that internationalism, in terms of, when we talk about ending the reliance on fossil fuels, we have to do it in ways that make alternative fuels, sustainable fuels, available to peoples and countries that do not now have them. It's not enough to say, we can't allow China to continue this level of per capita expansion of its reliance on fossil fuels, when at the per capita level, we consume so much more here. When countries across sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, don't have access to sustainable electricity. The answer isn't good enough to say, well, we have to make sure they're not using fossil fuels. We have to make sure they have access to electricity to save their lives. And we have to make sure they have the technology to do that in ways that are sustainable, not only make the point that they can't have what we have relied on for 100 years.
Well, one of the good things that actually is happening in a number of countries that have been historically oppressed and colonized by European powers, European countries, they're kind of jumping over, going from very few energy sources, instead of going through the fossil fuel stage. Increasingly, there are places where they're jumping to the renewable energy stage because it's cheaper, it's cleaner. You can be more independent because you're not dependent upon a fossil fuel company somewhere that's bringing the stuff out of the ground and shipping it and so on and so on. And that's a hopeful thing. That's not happening certainly as extensively as it should be, but it is happening because increasingly countries are seeing, these developing countries are seeing that this is a better way to go, both economically and in terms of the quality of people's lives, the air quality, the water quality, the land quality. There isn't the pollution that comes with fossil fuels, and that you get reliable energy as a result. So that's a hopeful thing in terms of some of what's developing in the formerly colonized countries of the world.
Thanks. I'll be getting a follow-up email, as I said, out to everyone tomorrow. We always like to leave with some action steps. There are just a couple more questions, but I just want to get to this real quick. We see this as a call to support your local peace and environmental movements. New Jersey Peace Action, Coalition for Peace Action in Princeton, 350 NJ Rockland in North Jersey. All these links will be going out to everyone. Food and Water Action in New Jersey, the Institute for Policy Studies. All these organizations are working so hard on all these different issues and very desperately need your support. So please support your local organizations, support your organizations in Washington that are doing all this hard work. Urge Congress, especially if we get a new Congress, and again, that's not going to be any kind of solution to anything, to take up the new Green New Deal legislation, including the anti-militarism language, and fund it with costs from the Pentagon budget. Urge support for House Res 1003, sponsored by Barbara Lee, which proposed the exact $350 billion cut from the Pentagon budget that Phyllis spoke about. I'll send out the phone call to the Senate switchboard, the Capitol switchboard, and a little script for everyone to make some phone calls in the next day or so. They really do want to hear from us on foreign policy issues. They don't hear very much about it, and they'd love to hear more about it. And if there is success in removing number 45 from office in November, do not relax. It really means we need to redouble our efforts to make sure the Democrats listen to us. They are frankly not a lot better at most of these subjects than the Republicans have been over the years. A couple of last questions we have before we'll go. If you folks are okay with staying just a few extra minutes.
Couple minutes.
Who are, if there are, best, most effective people in the military to talk to about reducing the military budget while maintaining necessities? Are there folks that you respect at that level that people can look to for knowledge on that point?
It's a good question. There's some very good people working in organizations like Veterans Against Iraq. It used to be called Iraq Veterans Against the War. It's now About Face Veterans Against War and Veterans for Peace. And there's another one, I'm blocking the name. It's Defense something, Defense. I'm blocking it.
Okay.
There's those three. Jose Vasquez is the director of it. But they all have good information out there. It's not hard. It's not hard to find. Groups like AFSC are doing good work on counter recruitment. There's a lot of work out there. The Poor People's Campaign documents their moral budget stuff, has a lot about the military. A lot of work with veterans are part of that. So that's another resource as well.
Great, and I'll get those resources back out via email. The Barbara Lee resolution number was HRES 1003. And the last question I see here, if there are any others, I'll get them to you in writing. What is your view of the necessity of degrowth in addressing climate crisis and militarism?
Ted, you want to jump in that one?
Yeah, there's no question but that the nature of the economic and political and cultural systems in much of the world are just way too, there's just way too much, there's wastefulness, there's so much wastefulness, there's so many things being produced and being sold, for profit that don't really need to be sold and that don't need to be produced and sold. There's definitely a need to shift away from the values of our existing reality for most of the world, not all of it, but most of the world, where the accumulation of things, the accumulation of products is the measure of success. That's really not true. So from that standpoint, yes, we can't continue on this path. I believe that that we, in terms of the amount of the resources that are used of the earth, that it might be May, if you take it on an annual basis, by sometime in May, I believe, we have basically used up one year's worth of the Earth's resources if we were going to be able to have a sustainable future. That's how bad it is. So we absolutely need to power down, change the economy in that way over time. That's definitely very important and critical.
I would agree with that. I would just add that I think that's the biggest obligation of us in this country, which is by far the worst perpetrator of that kind of carelessness with the earth. And it does also come back to the military budgets, not especially here, but around the world as well. If military budgets were cut back, if nuclear weapons that cost so many tens of billions of dollars around the world every year, if that were ended, if the militaries themselves were cut back, there would be money for and access to good medical care everywhere. Not just in this country where we choose not to have good medical care so that we can make a profit from it and make it a private profit gain, but it would be available to everybody. And not only primary care that basically can just keep people alive, but secondary and tertiary, the best care everywhere would be available to everyone if we destroyed the military budget and took the profit motive out of, for example, healthcare.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Ted. $1.4 million a minute. That's what we're spending on the defense budget. Somehow that makes it more real to me, even though 1.4 million a minute is a little unbelievable as well. But obviously there's a lot of waste, a lot of money that could be spent on human needs. So join your local, there are an awful lot of good activist grassroots organizations in the area. New Jersey Peace Action, we like to think, is one of the best. 350 NJ Rockland, Ted is doing amazing work over there. Food and Water Action, Coalition for Peace Action in Princeton. We'll get the names and links to all those organizations out to you in an email. Please get active. We need your help. We need your energy. We could use your money, all of it. It all is important to us so we can continue this hard work. There's a lot of work to be done, but there's progress being made. So keep up the good fight. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you again, Phyllis. Thank you again, Ted. Good seeing you both. And I'll talk to you all soon. Peace,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody. Nice to see you, Phyllis.
Night. Good to see you, Ted.